Welcome to Director's Cut. We're glad you guys are back with us this week. We're excited about gearing up for Easter and getting ready for this next weekend services. So we hope you guys can join us. We have a service at 7:30 that's going to be outside in our pit. And then we'll have breakfast and we'll have another service at 10 a.m. So I hope you guys can invite some friends, family, come on out and just celebrate the resurrection of Jesus with us. But before we get to that, we want to jump into our Director's Cut where we focused on last week. Last week, Luke talked a lot about the proof for Jesus as Lord, as God, and a ton of stuff to unpack there. So we want to dig right into that. We have a few questions from people who are in attendance, and so we're going to kind of go with that. So first question we have. So they had asked if you covered that Jesus claimed you as God, and I know that you did cover that. So I guess maybe they're asking if you could go a little bit more in depth with how or where in the Bible Jesus claimed you as God and how we can show that that's accurate.
Yeah, two of the passages that we looked at this weekend in the divinity of Christ, they were both in Matthew. One in chapter 16, one in chapter 17, and you know the 16 has the real famous passage of when Jesus is essentially interrogating his disciples, and he says, who do people say that I am? And they give this litany of things. Now, what's interesting is about that list of things, it says, well, some people say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're Jeremiah. It's a list of kind of a who's who of people that the Jews held in very high esteem. And so that there's a lot of telling stuff in that, even before you get to the declaration that Peter makes. People are saying that there is something different about Jesus. The people are saying that, hey, this guy is somebody super important, very, very important. So while, at least in those answers, it didn't rise to the level of divinity, they were putting them as close as you could get to that in the Jewish pantheon, if you want to put it that way, of people. And so these great, great, great guys that they say, oh no, you're the incarnation of these guys, is kind of essentially what they were saying. And then Jesus asks, Peter, his, the famous thing, who do you say that I am? And he said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And people say, well, but that doesn't prove that Jesus claimed to be that Peter said that. Well, the problem is if you follow up with what Jesus says, you're right. That seems awfully much like a claim to him saying, yeah, you're absolutely right. And it wasn't you that came up with this, it was God in heaven that showed this to you. So that was a revelation from God to Peter that Jesus agreed with, that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. Absolutely no question, a claim of divinity there. Then we get to the time of the transfiguration in chapter 17 of Matthew, and the voice from the clouds, this is my son. Boom. That one right there. Even more important than Jesus claiming divinity, God is saying he is. And then, we just kind of stayed in Matthew this last weekend talking about things. Probably the single best passage in the Bible dealing with Jesus' claim to divinity is John 8:58. And his famous statement says, before Abraham was, I am. Well, you have to understand a decent amount of Old Testament history to actually understand what he's saying there. First of all, it sounds, if you don't understand that, it just sounds like Jesus was really bad at grammar. He's not using the right tense there. But what you notice in that story is immediately the crowd that was with him, at least the kind of the Pharisee crowd and all that kind of stuff, they picked up rocks to stone him after he said that. Well, what's the big deal? The big deal is Abraham is, first and foremost, kind of the father of the Israelites. He's held to be one of the greatest of all the people that ever descended, or that they descended from. And so anytime you use Abraham, and it becomes important. But then when Jesus said, I am, what he's doing is he was using the proper name of God that God gave to Moses. Because Moses, if you remember back on Mount Sinai, Moses said, well, if I go down tell the people all this stuff, who am I going to say sent me? And God says, tell them I am sent you. And I am is this interesting name for God because he exists now. right? He existed now in the past, he exists now in the present, and he exists now in the future. It's that statement of I am. And so when Jesus used that statement, everybody in the entire area that could hear him say that had a Jewish background. They absolutely 100% unequivocally understood what he was saying, that he was claiming to be God in that. And so when he did that, that's why it infuriated them so much, because they saw that as blasphemy and they were ready to stone him, which was the penalty for blasphemy. And so we see this time and time again throughout Scripture. A lot of times Jesus answers the inquiry of, are you the Son of God? Are you Messiah? Are you all these kind of things? He answers them in his typical fashion that was not such a direct answer, but either answered with a question or simply said, yeah, you're right. So even before Pilate, we're in Easter week now. Even when he was before Pilate, Pilate said, are you the king of the Jews? And he said, you've said so. It's he's absolutely saying, yeah, and you're the one that said it. We don't always take that sort of communication the same way today, but time after time after time after time after time, in all of the Gospels, not just the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also in John as well, we see that claim to divinity. And so, this weekend we talked about Jesus really existed, and we talked about proofs that he was who he said he was, and he certainly himself made those claims too. So
just from what I've learned and stuff, if you don't come at like the Bible with the proper context, it's easy to miss something, especially with stuff like this, where you briefly mentioned like the Jewish context of I am,
right,
and that there's multiple cases in the New Testament where Jesus claims to be this, to be God,
right,
that we, as modern day readers might just look right over and not recognize it. So
definitely.
So do you think it's important then to understand the Jewish context behind those things? Where would you suggest people go to kind of find that?
So one thing is you have to understand, whether it's the Bible or any other piece of literature, even if you want to put it that way, unless you understand the context behind it, the historical context, the cultural context, all of these different things, you're always going to miss stuff. Now, sometimes it's going to be minor stuff, sometimes it's going to be major stuff. But anytime you do that, you read, you study, you always have to understand the context. And even more so, the further back you go in history, because the context is so different today than it was then. So the Bible is an interesting book because it was written over a period of about 1,500 years by at least 40 different authors in 3 different languages, 3 different continents. All this kind of stuff. So there's an enormous amount of context for us to have. It doesn't just say, well, we need to have a Jewish first century idea of context to understand what's going on in the Bible. Really, you have to spend quite a bit of time digging into it and sitting. And there's a lot of good commentaries that help with this. And that's probably one of the best things that a good commentary helps with when you're reading the Bible, is being able to see, this phrase, deals with this. This part here makes more sense in this context than in our context because, that's when it was written. Think about it now. If someone was to write a story about modern day America today, and we used the slang that we use today, we used the euphemisms that we use today, we talk about technology that we use today, we talk about whatever is important on the political spectrum right now, we talk about whatever's important from a social aspect right now. Take that information, or take that book, translate it into, some for a tribe that's fairly cut off from the rest of the world, hand that to them and say, read this and understand this. Even if it's the same time period, even if they read it in 2018, their context is so different than ours, they're not going to understand anything. And some of it's going to seem absolutely bizarre if we do it that way. And so having that context is so important. That's one of the things too when you get together in church, and that hopefully is something that pastors and stuff can help with, is that idea of the context, that idea of setting the stage just a little bit so we can have a better understanding of what's going on behind things. Because it's not simple. I mean, it's not easy. You know, God will absolutely reveal things to us no matter what, but we can get so much more if we're willing to put just a little bit of time and effort into studying that and digging a little bit deeper, especially in the context and the background and stuff.
So this next question kind of goes off of the first one. They mentioned the number of prophecies about the Messiah in the New Testament, or in the Old Testament rather, that Jesus fulfilled as recorded in the New Testament.
Yep.
How important are those to who Jesus is and who he claims to be?
So, yeah, there's tons and tons of prophecy. We talked about it a little bit this weekend, especially if you read through Matthew. Matthew spends a lot of time saying, hey, this was a fulfilled prophecy. Hey, this was a fulfilled prophecy, and all that kind of stuff. It's important, you know, there's something like over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament dealing with the Messiah. We don't have an exact number because some people say certain things are prophecies and some things aren't. So, I mean, but there's over 300 one way or the other. And God gave us those prophecies so that we could see him working throughout history. The prophecies don't necessarily prove that Jesus is the Messiah. In a way, they certainly do, but they're there to help us be able to be bolstered in our faith in a lot of ways.